This is part 3 of our Native American Sites road trip. This time we're heading to a desolate lava field. It was known to those who lived at Three Rivers. And in the 1500s, the Spanish treasure hunters found Comanche there. Then we'll stop at a roadside marker for the Trinity Site, where the first atom bomb went off, before heading up to Albuquerque to visit an old adobe village. Then a park ranger will tell us all about a nearby national monument. Our first stop is just 40 minutes northwest of Three Rivers. It's the BLM's Valley of Fires. It's a dark smudge on the map that covers over 125 square miles. After 30 minutes on Highway 54, we turn left on Highway 380 and pass through the tiny hamlet of Carriazozo, which benefited from the decline of white oak about 100 years ago. It was an old mining town where Billy the Kid and Pat Garrett spent some time, and a few of its buildings are still standing. And like white oak, Carriazozo has seen better days. Today it just has a couple of RV parks and small motels. Our next stop is 4 miles west. It's on a high spot surrounded by one of the youngest lava fields in North America. The Spanish were amazed to find Apache in this Malpais, and I know I'm pronouncing that wrong, but it's short for Badlands, or bad footing. As you can imagine, it was nearly impossible to cross it on foot or on horseback. All of this black basalt came out of a little vent. It's no higher than 20 or 30 feet above the lava. On 2 separate occasions, it spewed lava out for a decade or two. In places, it's up to 160 feet thick. Today, this BLM site is called the Valley of Fires. It has 19 campsites, and most have RV hookups. And there's a nice paved trail which makes it easy to explore and learn about the area. I tried hiking without the trail, and let me tell you, it ain't easy. On the trail, you'll see large rocks with rope-like pohoyohoi ripples that were formed when the lava was flowing very slowly across the landscape. There's little markers, and at marker 13, if you look carefully and maybe use your imagination, you'll see what's left of a collapsed lava tube. And in this one and some of the others, archaeologists say there's evidence that ancient humans used them as shelter thousands of years ago. It takes only a few minutes to walk the paved loop trail, a little longer if you read all the info signs. And according to one, bats, lizards, and roadrunners live here, though I didn't see any. Off the trail, there's not much else. There is a little souvenir shop. It doesn't have any food. I've got a park pass, so I'm assuming. And now it has one less refrigerator magnet. And with that, we're off to our next stop, near Albuquerque. I start by heading west on Highway 380, and after about 50 miles, I stop at a historical marker for the Trinity Site. The first atom bomb was tested just south of here. That site can only be visited a couple of times a year as part of a special tour. But even standing here makes you think about all that's happened since that fateful day. After just a few more miles on Highway 380, we head north on Interstate 25 to another historic Native American dwelling near Albuquerque. It's a state park, and unlike a national monument, it's legal to fly over it. It's called Coronado Historic Site, which is weird because its main feature is the ruins of a Pueblo of the Tewa people. Pueblo people and the Spanish play a significant role in New Mexico history. And at this place, you can learn about both. It's located near Highway 550, north of Albuquerque. Ancestral Pueblo people have been living in the area for thousands of years. In about 1300, they started building here, perhaps due to an influx of new residents who migrated here from what we now call the Four Corners area. They called themselves the Tewa. They were prosperous farmers and hunters when Francisco Coronado came through in 1540. He was looking for the 7 cities of gold and the fame that Cortez had received after conquering Mexico just a few years earlier. This place is much bigger than the village we saw in episode 2. This one had about 1,200 rooms, enough to impress the Spanish. There were 3 plazas and several ceremonial kivas. It was later named after the Tewa word for evergreen, Qua'awa. And sorry if I butchered that pronunciation. The site became New Mexico's first state park in 1935, An excavation of the 10-acre site started that same year. As you can see from this sketch of the excavation, there's much more to it than what we see above ground today. Most of the structures were reburied after the excavation to protect them. Only one of the three plazas is visible today. The Visitor Center also has a number of exhibits about the Tewa, Coronado, and the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. This was an important event in New Mexico history, especially for the Native Americans, and I wish I knew more about it. There are also displays in front of the Visitor Center, and a few picnic tables with a great view of the Rio Grande. Back in the day, this is where they planted their crops. Out back, there's a paved trail that loops past the reconstructed rooms. There's info signs along the way to tell you about the Tewa people. This square kiva was designed to look like the one they found the murals in. Today they're preserved in the Visitor Center, but no one is allowed to photograph them. In this kiva you can actually enter, but only with one of the park's guides. Most of the kivas I've seen at other sites in the Southwest have been round, and they had some round ones here too. So why is such an historic Native American site named after Coronado, a Spanish conquistador? Well, a sign on the trail kind of has the answer. It's because when the park was established, the archaeologists thought that Coronado had stayed there, and that was good enough for them to name it after him. They had no proof until the last few years, when a large archaeological metal detector survey found parts of a crossbow, nails, and pieces of chainmail. They believe that this is evidence of a battle. The place was abandoned in the late 1600s, perhaps because of a 20-year drought, or maybe that revolt had something to do with it. Residents likely moved to one of the nearby pueblos of Santa Ana or Sandia, as they claim their ancestors came from here. I've been to quite a few prehistoric native sites, and this is the first one I've seen where adobe was used. Adobe tends to turn back into soil, and this part of the site, near where the East Plaza was, has been reconstructed to look as it did in the 1800s. The real buildings, or at least their foundations, are still buried beneath. There's a $7 entry fee, and the hours are limited. It closes around 4:30, and they're closed on Tuesday. And all this information, of course, is available on the park's website. And yes, ironically, that is an Indian casino in the background. It only takes about an hour to see the Coronado history site. If you're doing the whole Rio Grande Rift road trip, or if you just happen to be in Albuquerque, this place is well worth the visit. It's one of the few places you can learn about both the Pueblo people and their first contact with the Spanish, which of course wasn't always pleasant. Coronado didn't stay long. Because he didn't find any gold, he went back to Mexico in 1542. But the damage was done. Though he could destroy their settlement, he couldn't destroy the memory of the ancestral Pueblo. On the west side of Albuquerque, there's a national monument dedicated to several petroglyph sites in the area. I went to each of them on my Rio Grande Rift road trip, but because I like Three Rivers so much better, on this one, I just talked to a very knowledgeable ranger. No, it wasn't him. It was David Adiavano. He was very helpful, and he's going to tell us about this place.
So we are at Petroglyph National Monument. We're a national park site here on the west side of Albuquerque, New Mexico. And we have over 20,000 petroglyphs. Petro means rock and glyph is carving. So petroglyphs are rock carvings. And of course the Southwest here is known for petroglyphs. And again, we have a lot of them. All of our petroglyphs are carved into a basalt. It's called basalt. It's a type of lava rock. And we have volcanoes here. On the western side of the park, we have 5 fissure volcanoes. And where those fissures were, or cracks in the earth, is where all the lava rock came out. A series of flows took place around 200,000 years ago and created this volcanic landscape. And of course, much, much later, native people, specifically the ancestral Pueblo, started carving petroglyphs here. Most of our petroglyphs were carved between 1300 and around 1680. And Petroglyphs are not a language as we understand a language. They were definitely communicating things. The ancestral Pueblo were definitely using petroglyphs as a form of communication. A lot of that communication were spiritual in nature, and they had really deep held beliefs having to do with volcanoes. It was part of their origin stories and their belief system. And so volcanoes were seen as a sacred place, and it's not by chance that they decided to leave their petroglyphs, again, many of which are spiritual in nature, here in large concentrations. Even people that live in the Southwest often don't know the difference, for example, between a petroglyph and a pictograph. A pictograph is a painting on rock, and again, petroglyphs are rock carvings. And what makes the Southwest really known for petroglyphs is that here in the desert environment, there's something called a desert varnish. It's like a patina that forms on the outside of the rock over a long period of time, literally thousands of years. The outside of the rock gets dark, and in the case of basalt is more natural color is gray, but then over time this dark, it's almost like a rust quality forms on the outside of the rock. But native people determined probably several thousand years ago that if they remove that top surface, they get into the lighter, more natural gray color of the rock, and that's what creates the contrast. That's how we're able to see these images. So there's no paint involved at all, and the weathering process will continue, and that's a rough way of we can sort of date petroglyphs is how faded they are. But that's not an exact science. It's certainly not anything to the degree of, say, carbon dating, where you're able to really kind of pinpoint a range.
So tell me about the different sites. There's nothing really at the visitor center.
Right here at the visitor center, we have a small gift shop and a film that we show. That's really it's really kind of native voices. It's from contemporary Pueblo people's perspective on the significance of this site and the significance of petroglyphs. And then you drive to one of the 3 petroglyph viewing sites, and then on the western side again we have the volcanoes, and there's no petroglyphs there, but there's about 3.5 miles of trail, and you're hiking among the what are locally known as the Three Sisters, the 3 largest volcanoes here. We have cinder cones and spatter cones, and they are small volcanoes. So fissure volcanoes are referred to as monogenic volcanoes, meaning they're kind of a one-shot deal. We believe most of our volcanoes, again, they were active around 200,000 years ago, which in geologic terms is actually not very long. And so up here in the high dry desert, there's a lot of features, geologic and volcanic features that are very well preserved. So our fissure volcanoes here are associated with the Rio Grande Rift, and that's a stretching of the surface of the earth that starts in southern Colorado and then stretches out into Texas. So it's a big swath of area, and that stretching has created that stretching of the surface of the earth has put us in closer contact with magma, which is usually really deep into the earth. It's put us in closer contact with that. So there's more susceptibility of that magma coming out. And there's a number of volcanic fields that are like us, that are associated with the Rio Grande Rift. Most of our petroglyphs, we believe, were carved between 1300 and around 1680. It's considered the Pueblo IV period. So it's really after the story of Mesa Verde, the story of Chaco Canyon. It's kind of the next stage where Pueblo people, ancestral Pueblo people, were leaving the Four Corners area and often connecting with other culturally similar groups that were already here on the Rio Grande River, but they were really developed. Those populations really swelled starting at around 1300, and they were coming from, again, the Four Corners area. So that's a kind of loose story.
Because there's more water here.
Well, there's lots of reasons that researchers and archaeologists believe that the ancestral Pueblo were leaving the Four Corners area, and certainly water is central to often those theories. It's not by chance that many of the settlements that ancestral Pueblo settled in were along the Rio Grande here, and we think most of our petroglyphs were carved by people that were living in a Pueblo that was along the Rio Grande, only a couple of miles from here. And they were coming up here for spiritual reasons having to do with the volcanoes. They were also hunting, and there's a lot of depictions of wildlife that they were hunting, as well as in some cases specifically hunting scenes that they were depicting in the form of petroglyphs. And they were probably also gathering some plants here. They were also growing corn here. They were farmers, the ancestral Pueblo. And in some cases they were growing corn around the escarpment, creating little terraces that were catching water and building up soil. And then so they were coming here for that purpose as well. There's only one area of the monument, which is called Boca Negra, the most accessible site that does not allow for pets. But pets will, if they're not on a leash, they'll run off, they'll chase wildlife. You know, this is a pretty harsh desert environment. We don't really want to add stress to the wildlife here, which are really eking out a survival. We have two types of rabbits, two types of squirrels that live primarily in this, what's called the escarpment here, this volcanic escarpment, which is basically the end of the lava flow. And all these boulders create little crevices and cracks where those animals, those rodents, can live and get and hide under. But it's a hard existence. So dogs, unfortunately, will get all excited and race after them. They'll also race up the escarpment after these animals, and that creates erosion problems. The escarpment's very, very susceptible to erosion, and we don't want to create an additional erosion, because then eventually the boulders with the petroglyphs on them can actually become unstable and fall over. And then also dogs can get into, they can be aggressive, they can scare young people, etc. The other problem is that the monument is entirely filled with coyotes, and there's many examples of coyotes attacking and taking pets, dogs that are off leash, and we've never had it happen with any animal that's on a leash. Coyotes generally will avoid people.
What about their urine?
Well, that can also be a problem. They'll start digging after an animal. They could urinate, and then that could throw off some wildlife. But it's more the digging and chasing animals that's a real issue for us. The three petroglyph viewing sites are all a little different, but they all have very good petroglyphs.
I want to thank David again. He summed up the park very well. The nearest petroglyphs are just a few miles away. The other sites are a bit further, at 20 to 30 minutes away. They're good places to stretch your legs on hiking trails. But like I said before, I found Three Rivers to be much more interesting. But if you're traveling with your dogs, this is one of the few places on this trip where you can take them with you, as long as you keep them on a leash. If you really want to check out all the Petroglyph National Monument sites, check out my Rio Grande Rift road trip. Well, that's it for part 3 of our Native Sites road trip. Next time, we're going to go on a great road to Chaco Canyon to walk in the largest stone structure in North America. And we'll learn about the importance of kivas. Then in the Four Corners, we'll walk in one of the finest restored kivas anywhere. I'll show you Cliff Palace in Mesa Verde, and a remote site where some of the finest stone masons are said to have called home. That's all next time in part 4. Please remember to subscribe and like this video. It takes a lot of work, and that's one of the best ways you can support this channel.